Welcome back to the show. We're about to learn the secret sauce. So Zeke, wanted to chat about your open source journey because you're actually pretty prolific, and I don't know if you'd consider yourself behind the scenes, in front of the scene, but you've done a lot of stuff. So why don't we start with who is Zeke first?
Who is Zeke? Wow. Okay. Well, in the context of what we're talking about here, of course, in my regular life, I'm a dad and I have a family and I live in Berkeley. But for work, I mostly work in AI these days, doing this startup called Replicate. But yeah, I've been working in open source software development for a long time. I've been doing web stuff since, the early 90s. I just watched that Kelsey Hightower Kubernetes talk that you did last month, and had a lot of parallels there in terms of not going to college, but being really interested in computers from a young age and figuring out how to make web apps, make web pages, and get paid for it.
Yeah.
So I've just had this sort of long career of just climbing higher and higher and finding more and more interesting opportunities. And I think part of it is just that I want to be creative. And when I find barriers to creativity, I want to kind of break them down or simplify things. So I know a lot of people that you have on your show are really talented software engineers. Well, I'm not actually a very good engineer.
Interesting. Yeah.
I'm not good at solving problems. I'm not good at fixing bugs. But I am good at breaking things down and making them simple. And so the last 10, 12 years of my career have been really focused on that.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great way to put it too as well. And because I look at the stuff that you've done and I'm like, oh man, you've touched so many different things. And I've actually looked at your PRs before in the past and be like, okay, I'm going to learn from this. Because again, I've seen your work in Electron, most recently, some stuff internally at GitHub. You'd help build out you built out the doc stuff, right?
Yeah, I helped internationalize the docs and open source the whole docs site for GitHub.
Yep. And so I know you from most recently from there, but let's actually take a tour down memory lane and start from the beginning. So did you, what was the interest in eventually learning the code?
I think in the very beginning, it was there was this product called Macromedia Flash in the late 90s. ActionScript. Yeah. So Flash was this program where you had a timeline and you had a stage, and it was sort of like Photoshop in the sense that you could put things on different layers. But then in addition to the layered aspect, you had this time element where you could animate or transition things on different layers. And so that was that was a GUI that you could use to create, animations and games and things like that. But then I realized that you could actually write scripts to do that same thing. When you take something that's kind of a manual process and turn it into something that's managed by a computer program or a script, you have so much more flexibility. So I spent a lot of time just making crazy fun animations with ActionScript in the late 90s, early 2000s. And that ActionScript was part of ECMAScript, which is the same sort of language family that JavaScript is a part of. So even though I wasn't really doing any legitimate browser coding at the time, I was sort of getting the foundation for being able to write code that would ultimately work in browsers. So I was kind of a scrappy developer for a long time, did PHP and MySQL and Windows, and I built my first shopping cart application in the early 2000s, and I wasn't very good at it. It probably had a lot of security holes, and I think we were even storing credit card data in a way that was not PCI compliant and stuff, but learning a lot along the way. And I worked for a bunch of branding agencies. And so I got to be exposed to different kinds of design, industrial design and print design, graphic design, stuff like that, which I'm still not especially good at, but I love design, and I love being part of teams that do interesting design. And I also really love language. So sometime in, I think right around 2009 to 2010, I watched this TED Talk by a woman named Erin McKean, who was the head of the Oxford University Press in the United States. So she was the Oxford English Dictionary boss in the US. And she gave this TED talk about how she was so frustrated with the state of dictionaries and how, the web is just exploding, and that's where all the real sort of like valuable language information is. But then we have these like crusty old books that small teams of people maintain that are supposed to be like the sort of canonical representation of what language is. And she was kind of bugged by this. And there was someone in the audience who was sort of a prolific earlier investor in Facebook, and was like, maybe you should just turn this into a startup. So she moved to the Bay Area from Chicago and started this company called WordNik. And the goal of WordNik was to build APIs around the English language and build the world's largest English dictionary. And so she had this concept of what she called a free range definition, which was it was the idea that when you learn words, you learn them from other people saying them. You don't learn them from opening up a dictionary and reading the definition and being like, oh, okay, now I get it. You hear people saying it.
It's like context.
Yeah, and you start to absorb it. So a free range definition is basically a word out there in the wild somewhere on the internet that has enough context around it to define the word. So she hired all these, natural language people, linguistics people with computer science backgrounds to start harvesting these free range definitions from the internet and using them to compile this big data thing. And at that time, I was really interested in Ruby on Rails, and I was kind of starting to level up to being like a legitimate software developer, like writing tests and, being able to write scalable applications and stuff. But I was so pumped about the idea of working for WordNik. So I moved to the Bay Area. I moved to San Francisco on January 1st, 2011 for my first venture capital funded startup job. And that was really when it started to kind of like take off for me, and I started to make a lot of connections and do some really interesting work. Ultimately, WordNik was not a successful business. The idea behind the business was to make APIs that could be used by game developers or educators to incorporate word data into their apps. But the problem was they're just not, people just don't expect to have to pay for that sort of thing. Like there are other sources for finding that kind of thing. So we didn't have a great business model. But one thing that we did do well is we built an internal open source project called Swagger. And Swagger was basically a JSON file or a YAML file that we used to describe the APIs that we had internally. So we had one team that did they maintained the API and they wrote everything in Java and Scala, and they maintained a MongoDB database. And then we had the web team, and they wrote everything in Ruby on Rails, and they were more interested in JavaScript. And there was some really cultural differences between those teams. It was like the XML team and the JSON team, butting heads. So it was hard to get the APIs we wanted because the API team didn't necessarily speak our language. So we created Swagger as this way of having a shared contract for here's the API I want before we even did any development. Just, does this look like something you can build and something that I can consume? And it became a contract that we could use to design before actually building. But we didn't actually know what Swagger was going to turn into. So now Swagger's called OpenAPI, and there's a bunch of politics around why that got renamed. Basically, some company tried to,
own the trademark,
own it, and everyone was like, "Well, no, it's actually just this open source thing. So we're gonna fork it and call it OpenAPI," which I think is awesome.
Swagger was a good name, though.
Yeah. So the reason the name came from, there was a thing from Microsoft called the Web Application Description Language, which was an XML thing. So people called it Waddle. So my idea was why Waddle when you could Swagger?
Okay. Did you name Swagger?
I did.
Oh,
yeah.
wow. Okay.
Yeah.
You heard it here first. Well, I don't know. I honestly had no idea, but yeah, I've been using Swagger OpenAPI for a very long time. So cool.
Yeah, we had no idea that it was going to turn into what it is now. But So my boss, Tony Tam, he wrote the original spec, which was like this very long document with all the like capitalized musts and shoulds and all that sort of stuff, like the legalese of like how to really use this thing. I think I wrote the first JSON schema, and then I also wrote the Swagger UI, which was like this thing where it was like, oh, well, we have a bunch of JSON data. We can just render it on a page and see what it looks like. And then so then we had documentation for our API. And then it was like, actually, well, we know all the data types because we just wrote them into this JSON file. So then if it's like, a multi-option list, then, we can turn that into a dropdown. And we can actually turn the thing into a form where you can run the API right in the browser, where you put in your API key or you authenticate or whatever, and then you're testing the API without having to write any code.
Yeah.
And that was like, it was like an accident, just kind of like happened.
It's wild because like, but I mentioned we started this podcast before we started shipping any code for open source.
Yeah.
And at that point, we actually built an API first for open source, and we built it in OpenAPI.
Yeah.
I'm Freudian slip nonstop.
Yeah, it's really hard to not say OpenAI or OpenAPI.
But yeah, API.OpenSauce.pizza is Swagger.
Nice.
And you can go test and get endpoints and data and see our future features before we get UI on it.
Yeah.
Today, which is a lot of my conversations are like, hey, here's an endpoint, or here's the API like linked directly to the form. This authenticate and you're good.
Yeah, it's amazing because like if you actually just hand over an OpenAPI schema to developers, that's actually often what they want. It's just like, I don't want all this like ceremony around what your API can do and all this documentation and tutorials and stuff. Like those things are good, but sometimes you just want the raw reference data, and the OpenAPI schema is like the closest thing you can get to just like, this is what this API does. Like, and later that became a project that I worked on at GitHub, but that was many years later.
Excuse me. But yeah, fascinating. So like, take a step back. Like, so Aaron started WordNick. It didn't work out.
Yeah.
But what's interesting is like that natural language processing is a thing that's like, it's common knowledge and folks are doing it now. So I was curious, like, did Aaron go back to the well, or anybody ever solve that problem?
Yeah. So one of we used to have these like sort of hack day 20% time kind of things where we would just do like experimental stuff at WordNick. And one of the people who worked with us named Will Fitzgerald, who came to us from PowerSet, which was this very interesting search company that was basically the predecessor to Bing. Like Microsoft bought them and then they became Bing. Oh. They had this like, I think it might have been a Google Ngrams thing. It might have been Bing. I can't quite remember, but they made a story generator, which used this concept of Ngrams. So a bigram is a pair of words, 2 words together. A trigram is 3 words together. I don't know if there's a word for a tetragram, maybe for 4. Pentagram, I guess, although that means something else usually. Yeah. Anyway, arbitrary number of words paired together. So you can imagine if you're scouring all of the text that's ever been written by humanity, you could start to collect these pairs and these triplets. So when you're doing like a Google search and you start typing something, you get the autocomplete that's telling you, suggesting the next word. That's based on the statistical likelihood of that word following the words that preceded it.
Yeah.
So this guy Will made this story generator where you would give it the first 4 words of the story or the first 5, and then it would just ramble based on that, moving one word over at a time and generating the next word. And so it didn't make any sense, but it read like one long continuous sentence because all the previous 4 words for every word always made sense.
Yeah.
So it didn't go anywhere. It was kind of meaningless. It was just an experiment, but I found it really fascinating. And now we are 12 years later, and we can dig into this, but we have this thing called, we have these language models, and most of them are based on this idea of this thing called transformers. And credit to the three brown, 1 blue YouTube series. I think that's what it's called.
Yeah.
It's got the little funny animated pie character. They just did a video about how transformers work that is so helpful, because I've been trying to figure out how this actually works for a long time, and I'm starting to understand it. But the gist is, the way a language model works is it's doing that same thing. Like based on all the data that I've consumed, the most likely word next is, and there's like a list of suggestion of possible words. But the thing that is crazy about transformers is that it is also looking at the surrounding previous words in the context to know what version of that word you're talking about, or contextually, what is the most relevant word. So it's the n-gram thing plus contextual awareness.
Yeah.
And that's basically like how language models work. And like, that's the sort of like fundamental piece of all of this like really amazing innovation that we're seeing in AI right now. So for me, it's really cool to see like the like really rudimentary version of it that was happening 12 years ago that was like state of the art. And that was a 5-word context window. And now we have like table stakes is like 200,000 word context window.
Yeah.
And then Google Gemini has 1 million or whatever. So
yeah. And
I'm getting off on a tangent here, but like thinking about the sort of arc of my career, like it's pretty interesting to see these things come back around after all these years.
yeah, and it's like it sounded like, because like we'll get to other things as well, but like you've kind of been seeing the earliest like ActionScript, ECMAScript. You also got into Node, so like you mentioned Ruby on Rails.
Yeah.
But I know you from the Node community. So like, how did you get from, okay, now we have the Swagger stuff.
Yeah.
Like, how'd you get in the Node ecosystem then?
Yeah. So JavaScript's been around since the 90s. There was like a brief time where Microsoft made a sort of competitor to JavaScript called LiveScript. And there was this sort of tenuous moment where we didn't know what was going to happen. And people had to write 2 different versions of the front end code to make their web app work. We didn't call them web apps in those days, but like, then like Netscape kind of folded, and they managed to like, as they were going down in flames, they managed to like set up this new protected entity called Firefox, which was this like new open source browser that was like going to come out of the ashes of Phoenix or whatever it was called. That was at Netscape, the like engine. I forget all the terminology, but Firefox sort of like crystallized this thing of like, I don't know, maybe it was like 2005 or something. It kind of crystallized the idea that JavaScript was going to be like here to stay, and that it was going to be powerful and useful. But that was still years before Node. So I was doing Ruby on Rails development in the like 2007, 2008, 2009. And of course, if you're building a web application, of course you have the back end, but if you want anything to happen inside the web browser, you have to write some JavaScript. And so when Node came out, I remember having this feeling of like, oh, that's like what the cool kids are doing. And I'm still over here doing Ruby on Rails stuff, and I'm kind of missing out. Although it was still really early. It was like, that was like Node 0.4.
Yeah.
And it was this kind of like this infantile project. But I could see the promise of it because it was an opportunity to write code that would have shared logic between a server and a web browser, which is like great. Now we don't have to have like, kind of back to like the Swagger Wordnik problem. We don't have to have like the team that owns the API and the team that owns the front end, because we can write the code in the same application using the same, in the same language using the same tools. So to me, it was like, obviously everyone's going to go in this direction. But then I went to work at Heroku, and I sort of joined Heroku out of spite because at Wordnik, we didn't have the opportunity to deploy production services unless they went through the like Java. They had to be part of this like Java monolith basically. And I didn't want to write Java. I didn't want to figure out how to write Java. I wanted to write apps in whatever language I wanted to use and deploy them on Heroku. But at the time, Heroku was sort of seen as like a toy, or I mean, it still kind of is seen as a toy by some people, but prototyping tool. So I was so interested in Heroku and how they made it really easy for sort of not very good web developers like me to be able to build an application, easily deploy it, scale it, connect databases and logging services and email sending services and stuff to it with like very minimal configuration. So I went to Heroku kind of like with this feeling of like, I actually don't like doing this stuff. I'm not interested in like, I'm not like a systems developer, but I just love how great this product is and how it's made me able to be like a full stack developer, even though previously I was just making web pages. So I assumed that when I got to Heroku, all those Ruby developers would be like, yeah, Ruby's actually not that cool anymore. We're going to start doing everything in Node. But that was not the case at all. It was either everybody was still loving Ruby because it had this beautiful syntax and was just so, such a humane programming language to look at with your eyes and interpret. But everybody was moving to Go because Go was like this really fast, safely typed, easy to test, hard to break programming language that could, outperform. It was like kind of Ruby and Go were sort of on the opposite ends of the spectrums in terms of their like performance capabilities. Like Go's really, really fast and Ruby's really slow. So all these people who were working at Heroku building the actual foundation of Heroku were really stoked about Go. And I was like, okay, Go's cool, but I don't want to write that because I want to write web applications. I want to build web apps. So Heroku initially was a Ruby platform, but they had started to pivot into being a polyglot platform, meaning that you could run any kind of code there. So there were like these things where if you did like git push Heroku master and your code had a package JSON file in it, I would be like, oh, that looks like a Node app. That's not actually a Ruby on Rails app. So let's send it to this other build process. And so those things were called build packs, and those were open source. So I was like, well, we have this Node build pack that this really talented developer, David Dollar, had built as like a prototype, but it wasn't maintained and there wasn't any team maintaining it. So even though I wasn't good at that stuff, I was like, this is a huge opportunity because like Node is blowing up. So I became the maintainer of the Node.js build pack at Heroku. So that meant I devoted like a year of my life to getting good at bash scripts, basically.
Yeah. Not web apps.
Not web apps. No, like I keep getting kind of farther and farther from web apps, which is interesting. But that got me really connected to the Node community. So we had and it was one of the most sort of like fulfilling times in my career because I was working on a project that like people internally didn't care about or weren't really precious about because it was still like Ruby was still like dominating. But I could see the writing on the wall, and it was like we had something like, I don't know, 5,000 deploys an hour of Node apps on Heroku. And so I could change one thing about the build process, and then all this data would pour in, and I could see how much I was like slimming down the build times, and then thinking cumulatively like, wow, okay, so that's like 5,000 deploys an hour. If I shave like a minute or two off of each of these builds, it's like, that's adding up to a lot of developer time, like a lot of time that is no longer wasted. So I felt like I had this huge lever for being able to like really improve developers' lives. And that was going really well for me. And I had this kind of like private little niche at Heroku where I was like the Node guy, which was kind of a problem too, because I'm like, well, I'm actually not very good at this stuff. I just think it's cool, like I'm not an expert. But meanwhile, the Node and NPM ecosystem were kind of falling apart because Joyent had not been a very particularly organized steward of the project. And
this was the IOGS time?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, just before that. So the NPM registry was maintained by a company called Nodejitsu.
Yeah.
And they were based in New York, and they had this they were trying their hardest to keep the registry alive, and it was filling up with lots and lots of NPM packages, and the traffic was just getting out of hand. And they had this sort of bespoke database configuration where they had this database called CouchDB, which was a really sort of interesting project that was kind of very web forward. But it was a little bit like a house of cards in terms of the way the registry was designed. And the registry was getting so insanely popular because of the ease of using NPM and publishing packages with NPM, that something needed to happen. So Isaac Schluter, who was the creator of NPM, turned it into a company. He raised capital and started NPM Incorporated in Oakland. This was in like 2014, I believe. And I was like, okay, well, that's the place to be. Cause like Node is at that time I just felt like NPM and Node are sort of like at the epicenter of web development. It's like where it's all happening. Everybody's typing NPM, blah, 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 all day long, every day. So even though I had this really good thing going at Heroku, I just felt like I have to chase that opportunity and see where that leads. And ultimately, working at NPM was not a great experience for me. It was tough because, again, it was sort of like the WordNick thing in that there was no business model. Like the idea was, okay, we'll sell private packages. But GitHub had already kind of solved the problem of creating NPM private packages by just putting their code on GitHub. Like still to this day, you can type npm install Bdougie/pizza, and that's just going to like go straight to Git and install that as if it were an NPM package right from your GitHub repository. Yeah. So that's always been part of NPM. And so when people wanted to use a private package, they were just pointed at a repo or a branch in a repo where the build of their stuff was. And as long as they have a secret configured so that, the NPM and Git client can authenticate to that, then you don't need private repos. So the whole like basis of this is how we're going to make money didn't actually make a ton of sense. Meanwhile, usage of NPM is going through the roof and it just didn't make a ton of sense. And actually I want to talk, there's a corollary here, I think, with Hugging Face that we can get to at some point. But
it's interesting because I just ran into Isaac yesterday at an event in SF, and we're gonna have him on the podcast as well to talk about that journey and the story. Because now they're working on Volt, which is a whole different approach to the problem with Darcy Clark. And I think Roy and a few other NPM folks are there. So I don't know how much you overlap with the sort of, I was say like the folks who were the last torchbearers of NPM.
Right.
They all have now started Volt, and it's a fascinating experience. But also, I lived through it, and I also joined Netlify a couple years after that, where I remember the Heroku build pack, like for Node, like it worked at the time when I was like building like Node apps and eventually React, but then it didn't like quite need, like you kind of did too much for like a React app. So then Netlify started, and Netlify and Vercel, Zeke, and a bunch of other stuff like Surge. All built like these build tool agnostic deployment platforms, which like completely just, like shifted course away from needing to run build packs on at least for Node apps on Heroku.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it was funny at Heroku, there were so many static web apps that people were deploying on Heroku. And it was like, so we're running a server just to like host this like rinky dink web page when we could actually just be, putting it on a CDN somewhere and pointing a, Apache added or something like that, and not having to actually run any servers for this.
But at that time, did you leave post Salesforce acquisition?
No, I actually started after the acquisition.
Oh, you started after the acquisition.
Yeah. Okay. So I was there during a time when everyone was sort of in this celebratory, now we don't have to do anything kind of mode.
Yeah.
Like there was still no management. There was just like a flat organization, even though there were like
how big was the company then?
100 people or something. 100. Like I think I was like the 85th person, or 86th or something like that.
Wow. So yeah, at that point, because I know post Salesforce acquisition, things kind of felt like it hit like a wall when it came to Heroku. So very interesting timing. But yeah, anyway, I wanted to share the context of my life during that time.
Totally.
But you mentioned Hugging Face. So like the Hugging Face you want to explain Hugging Face? You don't have to technically explain how it works, but yeah.
So Hugging Face has kind of become the de facto place where people store model weights when building AI models. So weights are kind of like you could think of them as the sort of artifact that's generated from the training process when you create a model, when you train a model. The result is like this big pile of numbers in a file that is ultimately the binary that you're using when you run a machine learning model or an AI model. And so Hugging Face is kind of like, on the surface, it looks a little bit like GitHub, but the collaboration doesn't really happen on Hugging Face. It's more like people are still writing their code on GitHub and then pushing the results of their model training process to Hugging Face as weights files. So in a way, even though they have, they have like an inference platform, so you can actually run code on Hugging Face. it hasn't really taken off to the degree that it has just become the de facto sort of like registry in a way for AI models. So what ultimately happened to NPM is like Microsoft bought NPM as, like a charity move because everybody needs it, but nobody expects to ever pay for it. It's just like, we all need it to build web applications. We need it to be alive. We need it to be able to scale, but we don't have any expectation that it's ever going to be a profitable piece of the puzzle. And I think Hugging Faces is sort of in a similar position in that like people have come to expect it as like, oh, that's where you put your model weights. And when I want to build my model and I want to deploy it somewhere, I'm going to pull the weights down from Hugging Face and then I'm going to put it in my own container somewhere and run it.
Yeah.
So I'm not an active Hugging Face user, but I see how much people are confused by it because it has so many bells and whistles and so many different sort of like capabilities. It's hard to know exactly what the offering is. Like people are like, what is it?
Yeah. I mean, I look at it as like that is like where you similar push to Heroku and like it's hosted somewhere. And then they do have like a bit of a chat interaction now that they shipped last summer, or maybe they came out of beta recently. But yeah, I'm just honestly, I use it mainly to find out, okay, is there something else that's out there that I could add to what I'm trying to build?
Yeah. I mean, you can kind of use it to get a sense of like the pulse of things and like where the action is. But then when it comes time to run that code, you can do it on Hugging Face, but most people are finding alternative ways to do it.
Yeah.
So of course I'm biased because I work for a company that Replicate lets you run AI models in the cloud and containers. So
yeah, and I find that approach really nice because I get that approach because I can just use the npm package to point to a model and start throwing stuff at that and getting the context in there and then presenting the result in the context of my little rinky-dinky side project.
Yeah, totally. So yeah, kind of fast forwarding a little bit. I went to work at GitHub for a while, did some really interesting things there. Met you, of course. Had a good time. But in the interest of time, I want to kind of jump forward to how I ended up working at Replicate and the connection there. So I was at GitHub working on internationalization stuff. So we worked on docs.github.com and it's now in a bunch of different languages. And there's a whole pipeline for translators participating in that process, which was super hard and super interesting and took like 2.5 years to get it kind of dialed. But of course, Microsoft purchased GitHub and for a long time, things were still fun for me. But after some time, more and more of the sort of like the agenda or the priority was around moving all of GitHub's infrastructure and services to Azure off of AWS or GCP or wherever else.
I experienced some of that when I was still there.
So that was less interesting for me, and I was sort of open to new opportunities. And then Ben Fershman, the CEO of Replicate, approached me, and I think he just knew of me from the open source world and started telling me about this idea that he and his friend Andreas were working on. And it was like, they wanted to build GitHub for machine learning. And I was kind of like, well, what is that? What does that even mean? And I was skeptical because I was kind of like, I don't really know what AI is. This was actually spring, like this time of 2021. So 3 years ago. But I could tell these guys were really interesting and really smart. So it was kind of like, okay, well, also they'd done some pretty cool stuff in the past. Like Ben wrote this thing called the command line interface guidelines, which is like this really cool long tome about how to build CLIs, just with all the sort of like old school 1970s Unix philosophy of standard in and standard out and all that kind of stuff. Small sharp tools, again, connecting back to Heroku. So I was kind of like, okay, this guy's a kindred spirit. And they see that machine learning is like this big, messy world where it's starting to show some real potential. Deep learning is becoming this thing, and people are like, wow, these models can do some really interesting things. However, the process of building them and distributing them and running them is really hard. And so we spent like the first part of my time working there talking to a lot of researchers who are like, academics working inside of universities or working for, big companies like Google or Facebook, who are trying to build machine learning capabilities, build models, and then share them, and being kind of stuck because they're SSH'd into some university cluster that can only run the model in a certain way, but like they don't know how to build a web front end to like send it to their advisor to be like, click on these buttons and then you'll be able to see what my cool model does.
Yeah.
So it was kind of like similar to the Heroku thing of like, well, you're a machine learning engineer, but like that doesn't mean that you can actually show your work to anyone.
Yeah.
So the idea of Replicate was about literally giving people a way to replicate their work, to like take someone else, some other academic's work, and being able to reproduce their results without having to read their PDF academic paper and try to reverse engineer it, or look at their GitHub repository with some janky old code that has like no README and no tests and try to turn that into something that actually produces results. So we wanted to solve that problem. And it's very connected to, so Ben often talks about this idea of like, what if we could do the same thing with AI that NPM did for like distributing and packaging software for running in Node or in the browser? Like if you could just like, NPM install a vision model, and all of a sudden now you have this model that you can like give it a picture and ask questions about that picture and it could just answer them. And you don't have to know how it works. You don't have to know how to install it or how to run it. So that's kind of the vision. So right now, Replicate is like it's a cloud hosted company. So we run public models that have their own API, as well as private models. And then there's an open source component to it. So there's a tool called Cog, and Cog lets you define a simple Python API around your machine learning model, and it wraps it up in a container, like a Docker container, with a standardized HTTP web service and a Redis web service. So every model that you package up in Cog, you can put in a container, run it on your own infrastructure, or run it on Cog's cloud or on Replicate's cloud, knowing that it's going to have the same API interface as any other model on the platform.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, I wish we jumped on a call and chatted about this last year when I was playing with it, because it makes so much more sense in like only the last like 120 seconds you explained this. So
okay, yeah, we need to work on our docs and our messaging for sure.
Yeah. Let me know if you need any help with that. I've got experience.
Nice.
But yeah, I mean, your journey is like full circle. Like you've kind of touched a lot of different things, seen a lot of different inflection points, and even like you've seen like trends. Like I know you were a skeptic on this AI thing, but you're here now.
Not anymore.
But even like the Node thing, the Go thing, like you've seen a different inflection point. So I was curious, like, what's your secret sauce for like making decisions for like tech stacks and technology? Like if you could concise that into like a nice soundbite.
I've become less concerned with the underlying technology or the underlying programming language because it's all getting more and more abstracted over time. So when I went to work at Replicate, I told Ben, I was like, dude, I don't know how to write Python. He was like, that doesn't matter. I don't know Docker. That doesn't matter. I don't know Django. It's not really a problem. I don't know if I'm necessarily answering your question, but like, I feel like over time, when I was younger, I used to feel this sort of like fierce devotion to a certain tool or a certain programming language, like Ruby in particular. Ruby people were just like zealots, right? Like there's no other way to write code except for Ruby because it's so beautiful. But over time, you realize that there's like a time and a place, and the context is important for you deciding what tool you want to use. So I know you had Evan Yu
in
here
just
earlier
talking about this,
and it was like you were talking about Vite and Bun and all this stuff, and I'm like, I've heard of those things, but I don't even know what they are. Like the landscape moves so fast that I would actually be kind of in trouble if I had to make a decision right now about what like stack to use or what frameworks to use, like in the JavaScript world. Of course, we do a lot of Next.js stuff at Replicate. we have like, sort of kindred spirits with Vercel in terms of like trying to build a platform that just makes it really slick and really easy to build stuff. And of course, people at Vercel, they had a DevRel team who used to build all kinds of really interesting. I think that's how you found out about it.
Yeah, that's how I discovered Replicate, which is like a good, like their AI SDK.
Yeah.
Like a lot of those ideas came from that, I guess, season that was happening when they were just building stuff every week.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think it's actually a really good way to like take a step back and say like it's not about like these teams that you have to be on. Yeah. There's like that one meme of the curve of like it depends, but in the middle it's like I don't know what to choose.
Right.
And but eventually it's just like it doesn't matter. It's like as long as you're building cool things and they work in production. I think that's really the goal.
One of the things I really like to do is so I use language models to write code a lot now. I know some people are like, I'm still better at writing code, but I'm like, no, this thing's definitely better than me. But one of the things I like to do is just sort of take a gamble and say, write me a script to do X. And I don't know what language this is going to pick. Like maybe it's going to pick Python. Maybe it's going to pick JavaScript. It's probably going to be one of those two. It might be Bash. But I just sort of roll the dice and let the language model decide what programming language it is. Of course, there are certain situations where there's already something I'm working on and I'm like, this is a Python situation. Let's talk about this. But I find it fun to just be like, roll the dice, see what the language model gods have to say about the best way to write a script to do X. Take all the screenshots on my machine and, put them in a directory or, turn them into a movie or something like that. So,
yeah, I mean, and it's getting better.
Yeah,
it's getting better really quickly. So we'll see what GPT 5 is going to give us. But the Meta stuff, the Llama stuff is like looking pretty good.
Llama 3 is really, really good. I know there's like this is sort of like a contentious topic, but there's Andre Karpathy, who was the head of AI at Tesla, and then went to OpenAI. See, I'm doing it now. OpenAI, a couple times back and forth. He has this pinned tweet which says, the hottest new programming language is English. And I totally subscribe to that thinking. It's like a lot of my work now involves starting with writing a markdown file that outlines my intentions for building something. And the more clear I am in describing the thing, the more likely a language model is to be able to produce exactly the result that I want. And a lot of people are using these sort of like chat-based interactions where you ask a language model to write you some code and you say, oh no, can you like do this a little differently? And then, it's like this back and forth that goes on. And ultimately, sometimes the language model starts to forget things about the earlier part of the conversation because the context window is too short. So they become forgetful. So I have kind of a different approach to building those things, which is I write the README file, I write the markdown file, I run it through the language model, I see what it produces. If it's not what I like, I don't then have a chat with it. I go back to the markdown file and change it to make sure that it doesn't make that same mistake that it made the first time. And I just end up with a document that is ultimately more and more clear about what my expectations are. And then I run that and it generates code. And from there, it's like an application that I'm using. But it's just getting better and better at that. Like,
you might have described GitHub Copilot Workspace.
Yeah, totally.
It's basically what they're shipping now, but like not meant to be a plug for that, but try it if you get access.
Yeah, I did get access. I got a little bit overwhelmed when I saw the UI because it has sort of like this idea of like, it was like strategize, plan, execute, something like that. And I was a little bit like,
it's very Jira.
Yeah, it was a little bit like, I don't know what this means. I get the gist of it, but haven't yet jumped in and actually given it a try.
Cool. But, well, I'm still waiting for my access. But speaking of which, let's wind this down. Appreciate you coming up all the way from Berkeley to Oakland. And folks, stay saucy.